I never thought one stormy night could shatter everything I believed about my marriage. But as the lights flickered out and shadows danced across the walls, I wasn't prepared for what came next. When my stepson entered the room, drenched and restless, the tension was undeniable. And when he touched my arm, I should have pulled away, but I didn't. That moment changed everything, and there was no turning back. Emily and Mark had been married for nearly 20 years, their relationship a portrait of stability, or so it seemed. Mark was a successful businessman, always traveling, leaving Emily to manage their sprawling suburban home alone. She had grown accustomed to his absence, filling the silence with books, gardening, and the occasional glass of wine. Mark's son, Ryan, had recently moved into the guest house after a string of setbacks, a failed startup, a messy breakup, and mounting debt. At 32, Ryan was sharp, charismatic, and a near reflection of his father's younger self. Emily had always found him polite, but distant, maintaining the formalities of a stepmother-stepson relationship. That night, a violent storm rolled in, rattling windows and cutting off the power. Emily had planned to spend the evening curled up with a book, enjoying the solitude she'd learned to embrace over the years. But Ryan's sudden knock at the door disrupted the quiet. "Need some candles?" he asked, standing in the dim glow of his phone screen. His shirt clung to his frame, soaked from the rain. Emily nodded, trying to ignore the flicker of nervousness that passed through her. As they lit candles together, the house transformed into a world of flickering shadows and hushed whispers. They sat in the living room, sipping whiskey to keep warm, and the conversation turned unexpectedly personal. "Doesn't it bother you?" Ryan asked, leaning closer. "The way he's never here?" Emily hesitated, caught off guard. "I guess I've learned to live with it." "You shouldn't have to," he said, his voice softer now. The words lingered in the air, charged with something unspoken. Emily brushed them off, laughing nervously, and excusing herself to bed. But as she reached for the door, she felt Ryan's hand on her arm, warm, steady, and lingering just a moment too long. Her breath caught as their eyes met, the flickering candlelight making it impossible to hide what they were both feeling. She pulled away and hurried to her room, but her hands trembled as she shut the door. Lying awake in the darkness, she replayed the moment over and over, torn between guilt and a curiosity she couldn't suppress. Something had shifted that night, and deep down, Emily knew it was only the beginning. The following morning, Emily awoke feeling uneasy, the events of the previous night replaying in her mind. She told herself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment brought on by the storm and the vulnerability of the blackout. But the lingering sensation of Ryan's touch and the intensity in his gaze were harder to shake than she expected. She kept herself busy, tidying the house and making breakfast. When Ryan entered the kitchen, freshly showered and casual, he greeted her with a warm smile, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Morning," he said, pouring coffee and leaning against the counter. "Morning," Emily replied, forcing a smile and focusing on her toast. But his presence seemed larger now, more invasive, and the way his eyes lingered on her made it impossible to ignore the tension simmering beneath the surface. As the day wore on, Emily found herself hyper-aware of Ryan's every movement. He offered to help fix the broken window in the sunroom from the night before, and she reluctantly agreed. While they worked side by side, she struggled to maintain her composure as the close proximity heightened her unease. "I appreciate your help," she said, attempting to defuse the tension. Ryan glanced at her, his eyes holding hers just a moment too long. "Of course. You shouldn't have to handle things alone." His words felt heavier than they should, and Emily quickly turned away, busying herself with the tarp and tape. But as they secured the window against the wind, his hand brushed against hers. Innocently at first, but he didn't pull away. Emily froze, her pulse quickening. She looked up at him, and for a brief moment neither of them moved. "We should," she started, but Ryan interrupted. "Emily," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you feel it too." She pulled her hand away, the tension snapping like a rubber band. "This isn't right," she said firmly, stepping back. Ryan raised his hands in surrender, but there was a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes, an unspoken confidence that unnerved her. "Relax," he said, offering a small smile. "I didn't mean to cross a line." But Emily wasn't convinced. She spent the rest of the day avoiding him, retreating to her room and telling herself it was all in her head. That night, however, the power was still out, and the isolation of the house seemed more suffocating than ever. Emily tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Her mind kept drifting back to Ryan, his words, his touch, and the way his eyes seemed to pierce through her defenses. Around midnight, a sound in the hallway startled her. She sat up, her heart pounding. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate. "Ryan," she called out, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped just outside her door. For a moment there was silence. Then a soft knock. "Emily, it's me," Ryan said quietly. She hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. Slowly, she opened the door, finding him standing there, shirtless and disheveled, his expression unreadable. "I couldn't sleep," he said. She opened her mouth to respond but found herself unable to speak. Instead, she stepped back, allowing him to enter. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension as he stepped closer. "This is wrong," she whispered, but even as she said the words, her breath hitched. Ryan reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Tell me to stop," he said. But Emily couldn't bring herself to say the words. And in that moment, she knew there was no turning back. Emily knew she should have pushed him away, but her body betrayed her. Ryan's hand lingered on her cheek, his thumb brushing gently against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. Her breath hitched as the storm outside raged on, but the storm within her was even louder. "This isn't right," she whispered again, but her voice lacked conviction. Ryan stepped closer, his body warm despite the chill in the air. "Then tell me to leave," he said softly, his eyes locked on hers. She couldn't. Instead, she felt herself leaning into him, as if the weight of her loneliness had finally broken her. Ryan tilted her chin up, and before she could think, his lips brushed against hers, soft at first, testing, waiting for her to pull away. But she didn't. The kiss deepened, and Emily felt herself unraveling. Her hands found his chest, his heart pounding as fast as hers. The flickering candlelight cast shadows around them, but in that moment, the rest of the world faded. When they finally broke apart, Emily's breathing was shallow. "We can't do this," she said, but her words sounded hollow. Ryan stepped back, giving her space. "I don't want to hurt you," he said. "But I can't stop thinking about you. I can't pretend this isn't happening." Emily wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold her breaking pieces together. "We have to stop," she said, though her voice trembled. "Do you want me to stop?" he asked, his voice steady, eyes searching hers. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned away, pressing her palms against the wall as if that could ground her. She heard Ryan step closer again, his breath warm against her neck. "I see the way you look at me," he murmured. "You can't deny this, Emily. Not anymore." His words sent a rush through her, and before she could stop herself, she turned and pressed her lips to his again. It was reckless, desperate, and everything she had tried to resist. The night blurred into heated whispers, stolen touches, and moments she knew she'd regret. When she finally pulled away, it was nearly dawn. Ryan lay beside her on the couch, his arm draped over her waist, his breathing steady. Emily sat up, suddenly aware of the reality crashing down around her. She covered her mouth to stifle a sob. What had she done? She slipped out of the room, wrapping herself in a robe and pacing the dark hallway. Her thoughts raced, guilt, fear, excitement, and longing all tangled together. By morning, Ryan acted as though nothing had happened. He greeted her casually, poured her coffee, and even joked about fixing the broken window. But Emily couldn't shake the tension. Every time their eyes met, her stomach flipped, and her pulse quickened. She avoided him as much as she could, but Ryan didn't seem to be backing down. That evening after dinner, he cornered her in the kitchen. "We need to talk," he said. "There's nothing to talk about," Emily snapped, her voice harsher than she intended. Ryan grabbed her wrist, gently but firmly. "Don't pretend this didn't happen," he said. "You felt it too." She pulled away. "It was a mistake." "Was it?" he challenged. Tears welled in her eyes. "You don't understand what this could do to my life. To yours." Ryan stepped closer. "I don't care about the consequences," he said. "I care about you." His words cut through her defenses, and for a moment she believed him. But reality hit hard, and she shook her head. "No," she whispered. "This has to end." Ryan's expression darkened. "You're lying to yourself," he said. "You can't just shut this off." Emily turned and fled to her room, locking the door behind her. She leaned against it, tears streaming down her face. But even as she sobbed, she couldn't forget the way he made her feel. The way his touch ignited something in her that she hadn't felt in years. Over the next few days, Emily avoided Ryan as much as possible, but his presence lingered everywhere. He found ways to corner her, moments to brush against her, reminders of what they'd shared. And each time, Emily's resolve weakened. It wasn't long before the lines blurred again. One evening, as the storm raged outside once more, Ryan appeared at her bedroom door. "This isn't over," he said. And deep down, Emily knew he was right. Emily's world felt like it was crumbling. She had spent days avoiding Ryan, trying to convince herself that what had happened was a fleeting mistake, a lapse in judgment caused by loneliness and vulnerability. But no matter how hard she tried, the memory of his touch lingered, haunting her in quiet moments and sleepless nights. Her guilt grew heavier with each passing day, especially whenever Mark called to check in from his business trip. His voice sounded so trusting, so unaware of the storm brewing back home. But things took a darker turn the night Mark returned. He arrived earlier than expected, stepping through the front door with his usual air of authority. Emily froze as he kissed her cheek, a kiss that felt colder than usual, and set his briefcase down. "You're home early," she said, forcing a smile and smoothing her hair. "Flight got cancelled," Mark replied, his tone unreadable. "Figured I'd surprise you." Emily's stomach twisted. She felt exposed, as though he could see right through her. And then Ryan entered the room. "Hey, Dad," Ryan said, his voice too casual. Mark's eyes flickered between them, and for a moment, Emily was certain he knew. The air in the room grew thick with tension, but Mark said nothing. Instead, he turned away and went upstairs, leaving Emily trembling. Later that night, Emily sat alone in the living room, sipping wine and trying to calm her nerves. She heard footsteps and looked up to see Ryan entering the room. "We need to stop," she said before he could speak. Ryan didn't respond. Instead, he sat beside her, closer than he should have, and took the glass from her hand. "We both know that's not going to happen," he said softly. "Ryan, Mark is home. He's going to figure this out." Ryan smirked. "Only if you let him." Emily's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" "You said it yourself," Ryan whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're tired of being invisible. Tired of living in his shadow." She pulled away, standing abruptly. "This isn't about Mark," she snapped. "This is about us crossing a line that we can't uncross." But before Ryan could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the stairs. Mark entered the room, his eyes sharp as they fell on the two of them. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice steady but heavy with suspicion. "Nothing," Emily said quickly. But Mark wasn't convinced. "Nothing," he repeated, stepping closer. "Because it sure doesn't look like nothing." Ryan stood, his body tense. "You're overreacting." Mark's eyes narrowed. "Am I?" Before anyone could speak, Mark turned and walked to the guest house. Emily's breath caught. She knew what he would find. Ryan's laptop. The notes. The photos. Moments later, Mark returned, his face pale and his hands clutching the incriminating evidence. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, slamming the papers down on the table. Emily's stomach dropped. Ryan tried to step in, but Mark turned on him. "You've been spying on me? Tracking my finances? What are you playing at?" Ryan straightened. "I'm protecting myself from you." Mark's expression darkened. "Protecting yourself? Or trying to take me down?" Emily stepped between them, but Mark shoved the papers toward her. "And you," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "Did you know about this? Were you in on it?" "No," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. Mark stared at her for a long moment, then turned back to Ryan. "You've always been a screw-up," he said coldly. "But this is beyond fixing." Ryan lunged toward him, but Emily grabbed his arm. "Stop," she cried. But it was too late. Mark shoved Ryan back, and Ryan lost control. He grabbed Mark's collar, and the two men struggled, knocking over furniture as Emily screamed for them to stop. In the chaos, Ryan's hand found the heavy paperweight on the table. Emily's eyes widened as she saw him raise it. "Ryan, no!" But the sound of the impact was deafening. Mark crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Emily dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as she tried to stop the bleeding. "Oh my God," she sobbed. Ryan stood frozen, the paperweight still in his hand. "I didn't mean to." Emily looked up at him, panic and horror filling her eyes. "We have to call someone," she said, her voice shaking. "No," Ryan said sharply. "No one can know about this." "What are you talking about? He's your father." Ryan's face hardened. "Not anymore." Emily stared at him, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. She knew in that moment that there was no going back. Ryan grabbed her by the shoulders. "We can fix this," he said. "But you need to trust me." Emily wanted to scream, to run, but fear rooted her in place. She nodded numbly, and together they began cleaning up the evidence. Wiping surfaces, disposing of the weapon, and dragging Mark's body to the garage. Hours passed in a blur. By the time they were done, Emily felt hollow, as though she had lost herself entirely. Ryan held her close, whispering promises that everything would be fine, but Emily knew better. The real nightmare was only just beginning. The days following Mark's death were a suffocating blur of fear and guilt. Emily could barely function. She moved through the house like a ghost, flinching at every sound, every knock at the door. Her mind replayed the moment Mark fell. The sickening thud, the widening pool of blood, until she felt like she was drowning in it. Ryan, on the other hand, seemed disturbingly composed. He cleaned the crime scene with chilling precision, wiping every trace of evidence. The rug was replaced, and Mark's body was loaded into Ryan's car under the cover of night. "I know a place," Ryan had said, his voice calm, as though he were discussing taking out the trash instead of disposing of a body. Emily wanted to stop him. She wanted to scream, to confess, to beg for forgiveness. But fear held her captive. When Ryan returned hours later, his clothes dirted and his face pale, Emily knew it was done. Mark was gone. The next morning, Emily forced herself to act normal. She made coffee, straightened the living room, and rehearsed lies in her head. Mark was out of town, she told anyone who asked. Business trip. He'd be back soon. But the lie began to eat away at her. She jumped at shadows, checked locks twice, and barely slept. The weight of what they'd done pressed down on her until it felt impossible to breathe. Ryan, meanwhile, acted as though nothing had changed. He joked with her, touched her shoulder in passing, and whispered reassurances when she broke down. "It's over," he said one night, wrapping his arms around her. "No one will ever know." But Emily wasn't so sure. Her paranoia grew worse when Mark's colleagues started calling. "Is Mark back yet?" one asked. "Tell him to call me when he gets in," said another. Each phone call was a dagger to her chest. She stumbled through conversations, her voice shaky, her words rehearsed. But it wasn't just the calls that terrified her, it was the questions. Neighbors asked why Mark's car hadn't been in the driveway. His assistant left messages, sounding more concerned with each one. Emily felt the walls closing in. Then came the detective. A knock on the door sent Emily's heart racing. She opened it to find a man in a dark suit flashing a badge. "Detective Harris," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "We've had a report that Mark hasn't been seen in a few days. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Emily froze, panic clawing at her throat. "He's on a business trip," she said quickly. Harris raised an eyebrow. "Funny. His office said he missed an important meeting yesterday." Emily swallowed hard. Something came up. And his phone. Voicemail. "He lost it," she lied, her voice breaking. Harris didn't look convinced. He glanced around the house, his eyes lingering on the new rug in the living room. "Mind if I look around?" he asked. Emily's pulse raced. "Do you have a warrant?" Harris smiled thinly. "Not yet. But I will." When he finally left, Emily collapsed on the couch, trembling. Ryan found her there and grabbed her shoulders. "You need to pull yourself together," he said. "They know," Emily sobbed. "It's only a matter of time." "No, they don't," Ryan snapped. "And they won't, as long as we stick to the story." Emily wanted to believe him, but the cracks were already showing. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure mounted. Emily couldn't escape the guilt. She drank too much, barely ate, and began snapping at Ryan whenever he tried to comfort her. "We're in this together," he said one night, grabbing her arm. "No," Emily hissed, yanking away. "You dragged me into this. You wanted this." Ryan shot back. "You wanted out of that marriage. You wanted me." His words hit her like a slap. "I never wanted this," she whispered. But it didn't matter. It was too late. When Detective Harris returned a week later, with a warrant, Emily's world shattered. They found bloodstains under the rug. They found Mark's phone in the guest house. And they found surveillance footage from a nearby gas station. Ryan in Mark's car driving toward the woods. Ryan was arrested on the spot, but Emily wasn't spared. She was taken in for questioning, and under pressure, the whole story spilled out. She told them everything. How it started, how it spiraled, and how it ended with blood on their hands. Ryan stared at her from across the interrogation room, his eyes cold and filled with betrayal. "You ruined everything," he said. But Emily didn't care. She was already ruined. Emily sat in the courtroom, her hands trembling as the judge's voice echoed through the chamber. The words blurred together: guilty, sentencing, probation. She barely heard the details. All she knew was that her life as she once knew it was over. Ryan had received the harshest sentence, 25 years for second-degree murder and evidence tampering. He hadn't looked at her once during the trial, not even when the verdict was read. Emily wasn't spared entirely. Though the court acknowledged her role as an unwilling accomplice, Her attempts to cover up the crime had sealed her fate. She was sentenced to 5 years of probation, along with 1,000 hours of community service. It was mercy, but it didn't feel like it. In the weeks that followed, Emily packed what little she had left and left the house for good. She couldn't bear to stay there, a place that once felt safe but had become a graveyard of broken trust and unforgivable mistakes. She moved into a small apartment in another town, far enough to avoid the stares and whispers, but close enough to never forget. The guilt lingered, like an invisible weight she carried everywhere. Nights were the hardest. She often woke up drenched in sweat, her mind replaying that awful moment. The sound of the paperweight striking, the sight of Mark's lifeless body crumpling to the floor. She tried to fill the silence with work, volunteering at shelters and painting, a hobby she had abandoned years ago. But nothing could drown out the voice in her head, the one that whispered accusations and asked the question she couldn't answer. How had she let it come to this? Emily thought back to the woman she used to be, lonely but safe. She had craved excitement, attention, and a spark to remind her she was alive. And Ryan had given her that spark, but it had burned her entire life to the ground. She often wondered what might have happened if she had pushed Ryan away that first night, if she had slammed the door instead of letting him in. Would Mark still be alive? Would her marriage have survived? She would never know. One afternoon, while sorting through boxes, Emily found an old photo of her and Mark, taken years ago during happier times. They were smiling, holding hands, and looking at each other as if nothing in the world could break them. Tears streamed down her face as she traced his image with her fingers. She hadn't loved him perfectly, but she had loved him. And she had betrayed him. That betrayal haunted her more than anything else. The realization that she had destroyed not only her life, but the lives of the people she claimed to care about. Emily's therapist told her to focus on rebuilding, to let go of the past and learn from it. But moving forward felt impossible when every step reminded her of what she'd lost. One night, as she sat on her balcony, staring at the city lights, Emily finally allowed herself to breathe. She couldn't change what she had done. She couldn't bring Mark back or undo the choices that led her here. But she could choose not to repeat them. For the first time in months, she felt something other than guilt, resolve. She would carry her scars, but she wouldn't let them define her. Because sometimes survival wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it. What would you do if temptation knocked at your door and shattered everything you thought was safe? Could you resist, or would you give in and risk losing it all? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Was Emily a victim of loneliness, or did she seal her own fate? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more shocking stories that reveal the secrets we hide behind closed doors.